The Denver Broncos wide receiver room looks set with the top heavy players of this offense for Sean Payton, but which players are competing for touches? We'll dive deep into that here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome to another episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where you know it's your team every day for all your Broncos news, content, coverage, analysis, more every single day, all year long. This is the place to be. So a special shout out to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. Thank you so much for tuning in and making us your first listen, however you choose to do so, whether it's on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. And if you're not yet an everydayer, come on, hit that subscribe or that follow button. That way you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team, including these in-depth training camp position previews. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports.
And I'm Sayre Bedinger, site expert at predominantlyorange.com.
Our training camp position previews continue as we focus on the wide receiver position here today. And we'll go through why the Broncos wide receiver room is set with all the top guys being listed at that position and what that means for the guys on the roster behind them. Are they competing for practice squad spots? We'll dive deep into that. Plus, we'll go into why this Broncos wide receiver room, specifically here, they're competing for reps and touches. They're not competing here for roster spots as Bo Nix has a wide arsenal of weapons to choose from this upcoming season. And then we'll go through some of the biggest questions surrounding this wide receiver room, individual player questions and narratives that we want to highlight as well. You get all that here on today's episode of the show. Sayre, look, I mean, not really a bold take here, but from what Sean Payton said back in the offseason program, there was a heavy indication that this Broncos wide receiver room, when we look at the guys who are returning, Courtland Sutton, Marvin Mims, Troy Franklin, Devaughn Vele, these guys are back in the fold, and new addition Pat Bryant. Seems like this wide receiver room in terms of that top four, top five is pretty much set in stone at this point, and Sean Payton gave the indication about snaps and touches versus roster spots. We'll dive into that later, but what do we think if this is the Broncos' top five wide receiver room right now going into training camp?
I think it's a good one. It's a young one. It's got lots of upside, maybe a bit of boomer bust. I think if you look at this roster as we've been doing these training camp position previews, Cody, I think wide receiver is one of those position groups that you could maybe argue is the biggest boomer bust position out of any group on the Broncos roster. And I'm sure some of the listeners will have different opinions on that. But to me, this is where Sean Payton is really trying to prove himself right. Remember earlier in the offseason, the interview that he did with Kay Adams, where she's like, I want to guess what your number one need is, and she's like, I think it's a veteran wide receiver. And he basically said, I think we're better at receiver than people think. And I mean, he's certainly put his money where his mouth is, hasn't he? Like, he's banking everything on Troy Franklin, Devaughn Vele, and a third round pick that was probably the most controversial of the entire 25 draft class here for the Denver Broncos and Pat Bryant. So to me, Cody, this is the position group where you could say arguably the most Sean Payton is really having to put his money where his mouth is, and he's betting on these guys. He's putting all the chips into the center on a young position group that has a lot of question marks, a lot of upside, but a lot of question marks, and certainly a lot to prove here in this as we get into July, where you want to see that chemistry develop with Bo Nix.
Yeah, and we'll ask and answer all those questions that we have surrounding this room a little bit later on as the show progresses here. But obviously, those guys round out that solidified group of wide receivers. But then let's factor in, an offseason signing in free agency, a veteran ad, more so for special teams, not necessarily wide receiver. And that was Trent Sherfield, who has been primarily a special teams guy, and he wants to become a special teams ace in the likes of, the guys like the Matthew Slaters, the New England Patriots back in that day. I'm trying to think of another guy. I mean, Tremont Smith is a special teams ace, but was he to the level of, Matthew Slater? Probably not. But Sherfield has aspirations to do that. So because of special teams, that definitely makes things a little bit interesting for Sherfield. But then they have A.T. Perry, who was a 6'5" option that they really, really liked. That was on the practice squad last year for them. He'll more than likely enter training camp, possibly ready to go for day one, or as what Sean Payton said at the end of OTAs, maybe someone who's a week late into training camp because he had some sort of medical procedure done in the offseason. And then you got other guys like Michael Bandy, who was on the practice squad last year, in a group of undrafted rookie, for instance, Jerwan Newton, Courtney Jackson, Kyrese White, and Joaquin Davis added into the mix here. I mean, the Broncos have a lot of guys. There's a lot of mouths to feed at this position. We know who the top heavy guys are, but for a lot of these other guys, it's more so trying to come in and maybe compete to make a case for, can they be that 6 wide receiver if Denver ends up carrying 6 guys onto the 53, or more so, can we impress enough to get a spot on the practice squad, which gives the team flexibility to elevate them on game days a few times. If there's an injury, you can move a guy up onto the active roster. There's flexible options here for Sean Payton, but there's a lot of young guys, and they have traits of size, explosiveness, and it's a really good speed too, which is something that maybe the Broncos are looking to continue to add there outside of the guys who are tall, as Sean Payton likes those guys.
Cody, did the Broncos do joint practices in recent years with the Green Bay Packers? I can't remember. For some, they did
last year.
Last year. Okay. So to me, when you look at this wide receiver group for Denver, it's being constructed very similarly to the way that the Green Bay Packers have been constructing theirs. Like, there's clarity at the top. You have guys that you've invested the most in, which for the Broncos, that would be Courtland Sutton, who's your big money guy, Marvin Mims, 2nd round pick. And then you have all these other players who have this intriguing blend of route running, athleticism, after the catch, size, speed, etc. That's kind of what the Packers did. And I can't help but wonder if the Broncos saw that last year in joint practices and they were like, okay, you can get all these different guys involved, because is there any team better than Green Bay at getting like 5, 6 guys, maybe even 7, I think last year, involved in the passing game at receiver, plus the tight ends, plus the backs? I just wonder about that, because that's the boat the Broncos are in. You've got a solidified group that you believe in. You've invested in these young players. And I think you could even say, Cody, the top 6 spots on this team are pretty well set in stone. I don't know that, barring a surprise, right? I mean, we don't see Vele getting cut. We don't see Franklin getting cut. We don't see, even at this point, Sherfield with his special teams ability. I mean, it's maybe a little bit up in the air, but you say those top 6 spots are relatively set. And so you feel good about that as a team builder going into the offseason program, going into training camp, because you feel like you have guys that, like you said, you want these players competing for snaps and targets, not just roster spots, because I think there's a healthy difference between those two things.
Yeah, and the Broncos, last year they were going into that where guys were essentially competing for spots. I mean, that's why they moved on from Tim Patrick, who, I felt like last year, and I'll rest my case on this, I still feel like Tim would have been such a valuable asset to Bo throughout last season. And granted, look, we're not saying he went to Detroit and put up these astronomical numbers, but he had a huge impact for Jared Goff in that offense there, where he was catching passes in the red zone. He was catching clutch passes on 3rd down to move the chains for them. He didn't need to be a 100-yard receiver. He just needed to be an impact guy. And the Broncos, I think, at various points of last year were looking for somebody opposite of Courtland to do that. And Marvin became that down the stretch here. But, man, it was almost kind of like pulling teeth to try to figure out which guy is going to emerge here. And that's banking on continued player development. So I'm in agreement with you. I think the Broncos right now going into camp, they have comfort. They're not going into camp saying, we're really trying to figure out if this guy's going to make the roster, whereas they already know which guys in mind that they have are going to be on this roster, and the rest is filling out, hey, who's going to be on the practice squad. I think that's a good problem to have here for the Broncos, especially for Bo Nix as he goes into year number 2 with different guys to throw the football to, which is going to bring us up to our next point here, Broncos country. We've already talked about Broncos receivers competing for snaps and touches, not necessarily roster spots, but what will those roles be, and who will be competing for more pivotal roles this upcoming season? Sayre and I, we're going to break that down here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's Locked On Broncos podcast is brought to you by our friends over there at Monarch Money. Ever wish managing your money felt easier? With Monarch Money, it can be. Whether you're growing your savings or planning on a big purchase, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. And it's like having your own personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. And Monarch Money, it's more than just a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center where you can track all of your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So in addition to managing your money, you're also building wealth.
Cody, you know me and my wife always have a goal to get back to Disney World a couple of times every single year. So what do we notice with Monarch Money? Well, we notice we're spending literally thousands going to Starbucks. So what do? We cut the Starbucks addiction. We got an espresso machine, and now we can save properly to get back to Disney World. And you can do the same with Monarch Money. Take control of your finances and use the code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNFL for half off your first year. There's some nice clarity on the Denver Broncos roster at wide receiver right now. The young players, Cody, they are going to be making an impact this year. Sean Payton has made sure of that. But what is that going to look like? How are these guys going to rotate in? It is going to be fun to watch these guys getting involved and utilized as chess pieces in Sean Payton's offense. We're going to break that down on today's episode, Locked On Broncos and Broncos Country. If you haven't already done so, you're going to want to hit subscribe wherever you listen to the show, and go find Locked On Broncos on TikTok, because there's short form content that you can digest. Get that on your For You page all off season long, so you don't miss out on anything that happens with your favorite team. But Cody, I think this is an interesting layer to the discussion, as you don't necessarily want to count your chickens before they hatch. I mean, somebody could emerge at training camp and cause a discussion about, hey, maybe even you consider keeping 7 receivers. I don't know. You get into the weeds of discussions like that. But with the Broncos being relatively set in the 5-6 guys that they want to keep at receiver, the discussion does pivot to, what does the rotation look like? I think we all agree Courtland Sutton is the top receiver on this team. Marvin Mims looks like he should be the number 2. But maybe there's even a discussion there. I'm interested to know your thoughts on this based on what you saw at OTAs and minicamp. Like, do you think there's currently an established hierarchy, or is it pretty wide open after Courtland Sutton?
I feel like there's a kind of an established hierarchy, but it's not in the way I think many people would think, right? I mean, theoretically, we would love to see Marvin Mims be wide receiver 2, but I wrote about this too. Someone asked me in a Broncos mailbag at Mile High Sports about this very thing. And I said, if the Broncos want Marvin Mims to be wide receiver 2, they need to give him more snaps. I mean, Sayre, he played 27% of the team's offensive snaps in 2024. And for him to put up the numbers he did down the stretch with only 27% of those offensive snaps, very, very impressive, right? He had significantly less snaps in 2024 offensively than he had in 2023 when Russell Wilson was the quarterback, when Marvin was caught on video talking to a fan saying, he don't throw me the ball anyway. So for me, I'm just trying to figure out, okay, if Marvin is going to become a wide receiver 2 or do that, the Broncos and Sean Payton need to give him more offensive snaps. There's no other way about it, because you can use Marvin anywhere and everywhere. You can use him on the outside. You can use him in the slot. You can use him in the backfield, as we have seen. And I feel like it's like, all right, with a guy of that skill set, don't you want that threat to be present almost every 2 downs on an offensive series? Like, I feel like that would be a little bit more of the response here. I don't see it going that way right now, and that could change. And maybe it's by design here in practice, right? Because everyone's going to be counting snaps and reps and things like that. But, for what I have seen so far in the offseason program before he missed all of mandatory minicamp, it very much appeared like Courtland Sutton and Devaughn Vele were the 2 outside guys, right? The 2 pillars there getting those primary reps. And then you would see Marvin brought in. You'd see Troy, brought in. You'd see Pat Bryant brought into the mix as well. It seems like those 2 guys, Sutton and Vele, are the primary guys, right? And I think if you look at snap percentage last year, it matches up to that standard. But then I think everybody else is rotating in. And part of me feels like, Sayre, it has to be maybe like a personnel grouping. It has to maybe do with the game plan, where you're at on, what side of the field you're on. Are you in opponent territory? Are you in your own territory? Is it third down, second down? The rotation may change specifically based on those situations here. So I'm very, very curious to see how this rotation actually works itself out. If I had to give a guess today, Vele and Sutton on the outside, the primary 2 receivers, the pillars there. And then I would say that Troy and Marvin are more gadget players here in the offense, whereas Pat Bryant will probably rotate in and spell both Courtland and Vele in that role that those guys play. And I also think Troy could play that role as well as the Z.
That is you kind of just blew my mind with the stat about Marvin's snap count percentage last year,
Crazy.
because I think that, yeah, it is crazy. You would assume, based on how well he played down the stretch, that he was playing at least 50% of the snaps, but that's not the case. I just looked, Cody. I found that the percentage of snaps that he played down the stretch of last season was not even 35%. And that's pretty wild, because for those final 7 games, I think it was, 7 games, he was on pace for over 1,000 yards if you would extrapolate those numbers over the course of the season. So playing less than 35% of the snaps, he's on pace for 1,000-yard receiving. That's crazy. I mean, so there's got to be a healthy balance between gadget player and like consistent involvement. I think about
Agreed.
Jaden Reed, to bring the Packers again into the mix here. Jaden Reed is utilized on a weekly basis to the point that, yes, he's got the gadget qualities, but he's consistently involved in the game plan. They are drawing up plays for him every single week. And I think Marvin deserves that kind of treatment as well, until it's proven that teams can shut it down, because on less than 35% of the snaps, if you're on pace for over 1,000 receiving yards, not to mention the times that he gets the ball as a ball carrier, and the threat that he poses to defenses anyway, I think that's a real incentive to get him more involved. And Sean Payton said about Troy Franklin as well, that they believe he has untapped potential after the catch. And so to me, that gets my brain going of like, all right, so how can they utilize that? Because we saw them try to do it on quick screens last year, and that really didn't work all that often. A couple times it did. I mean, it wasn't like it was never effective, but it wasn't as effective as I think you would hope for a guy who's good after the catch. You want him to get the ball when he's already running at full speed, instead of, all right, catch it from a dead stop and then go. So there's so much more Franklin can do. And I was just reading recently, Cody, another thing about Pat Bryant and how impressive he was at OTAs, and just the contested catch that he made over Jahdae Barron in practice, which I know that fans can make a big deal about that and things like that. But look, I mean, Pat has to factor into the mix too, doesn't he? I mean, he might be immediately one of the guys with the best hands on the team.
Yeah, well, look, and I would say that reliability, like you could see that he and Bo have been building chemistry quickly. And when Devaughn Vele missed minicamp, who was the guy getting Vele's reps? It was Pat Bryant. And Pat Bryant scored a couple of touchdowns in some of the passing periods that the Broncos had there. And once again, you saw him catching passes in traffic. Like that's a thing about Pat that I really like. And I just read an article too that Mike Kliss put out not too long ago, kind of about what Sean Payton, how he learned a lot about player development from his high school coach, going back to his high school days. And obviously when he went to college, and how everything kind of compounded to now. And one of the things that got mentioned in that article over there on 9 News was Sean was really fond and really keen on Pat Bryant, because they underwent a coaching change. Lovie Smith got fired, and Pat Bryant could have easily transferred and said, I'm going to go elsewhere, get money, and go play somewhere else. He stayed and was a very productive, impactful guy, was a team captain for them. And I think that's something that Sean likes, is like, we know if something happens to any of our guys, Sean knows and believes in his heart that, hey, Pat Bryant can be a guy that can literally step in, and we're not going to worry about that, because this guy's competitive. He's got heart. He's a leader. He's a captain in a sense there. And this is a guy who works extremely hard. You saw that in the offseason program with Pat Bryant, who I would argue is probably one of the more impressive players from a consistent day-to-day basis. Has, I'd say, great ball skills, can jump out of the gym, I think, which is another factor there that you really like for a guy like that. And, we're talking about all these guys. I mean, Sayre, you go back to Troy Franklin. One thing I also want to highlight here is, can we see a little bit more of that connection from Bo to Troy? Like what worked for them at Oregon? Of course, the deep ball was there for them at the University of Oregon, but that wasn't the primary. They would get them open on crossing patterns, different mesh concepts, where Troy would catch the ball sometimes at 7 to 8 yards across the field, and then he yards after the catch. That's where I think that emphasis is. And I even against the New Orleans Saints, Thursday Night Football, we saw the same exact thing. Troy Franklin was on the left side of the offensive formation, ran a backside crosser. Bo Nix found him for like a 20-something yard gain, yards after the catch. And it's like, why didn't the Broncos do that more with Troy? I think now that they have other positions addressed, where I think really if RJ Harvey, J.K. Dobbins, the run game is big for Denver this year, it opens everything up for this offense. You add Evan Ingram, who's going to be another wrinkle at the tight end position in the pass catching game. That is going to add another wrinkle for how defenses choose to play you. In a perfect world on paper, the Broncos and Bo Nix have everything that they need right now to explode this season. And this wide receiver room, I think Sean Payton's sitting saying, hey, I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm talking about. And now we have the pieces to go out there and do it. I hope they unleash it.
Yeah, I really do too. And I think that we will see it because these guys know they have to maximize their opportunities to get more snaps. That's what we're talking about. They're competing for snaps. They're competing for targets. How do you compete for snaps and targets? Well, you go out and make plays when your number is called. And that's what I think these guys are going to be ready to do in year two. Just like with Bo Nix, we heard at OTAs and minicamp, man, he's really taking command of the offense. He's out there doing a lot more doing and a lot less thinking. I hope that the same is true of these receivers, that we get to see that at training camp as well, when the pads come on, especially because part of having big receivers too, Cody, is that you want these guys to be physical, especially against a secondary like they're going to face every single day at practice. I mean, they're going to earn every single target, every single rep out there. They're not going to get anything cheap. So go out there and do what you do best and maximize those targets, those opportunities that you get now, so that you do build that trust with your quarterback, with your coach, with your offensive coordinator, with everybody that's putting together the game plan to say, we have to get Troy the ball. We have to get Vele the ball. We have to get Mims the ball and Bryant too. Like, none of these guys. The last thing we want is for any of these 6 receivers that we've been talking about, including Sherfield, to be inactive for a game day, to be a healthy scratch, because you want all these guys to be a threat to the opposing defense in the biggest way that they possibly can.
100% agree. And if Sean Payton has his way, then I think that will be the reality for this Broncos wide receiver room here in 2025. But Broncos Country, we're not done yet as we continue our training camp position preview here. We're going to focus on some of the biggest questions at wide receiver. Will Courtland Sutton get his contract extension? Will Troy Franklin finally have a big breakout year in year number 2 of his career? Can he take that Marvin Mims-like leap? We'll debate and discuss that here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. The biggest question surrounding the Denver Broncos wide receiver room, we're going to take a look at every single wide receiver that has some pertinent question surrounding them going into this upcoming season. And can the Broncos find a way to answer that question early on in the season or sustain it? That is the biggest question we'll go through here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Sayre, let's start off with wide receiver 1, Courtland Sutton. Really, there's no question about Courtland, about his play or about his production. That is guaranteed. That is proven. The only question surrounding Courtland Sutton is, will he get a contract extension before the season begins? I think that's probably question number 1.
It is, and I think he showed a good sign of faith for his part by showing up to mandatory minicamp and doing all the things that are asked of him there as a leader of the team and setting the example and doing what you see a lot of other guys around the league not doing that. So Courtland has come off the 2 best seasons of his career. The Broncos kind of rewarded him last year, right? And gave him a little bit more cash, a little bit more money. But at the same time, you want to get him to the point that you can definitively say Courtland Sutton's going to retire a Denver Bronco. And I think that's where he's at. I think that's where the team's at. It's just a matter of now we got to adjust to the ever increasing market out there, right? That's the rub right now, is that the wide receiver market, it's different than it was before the start of the offseason. So you're paying a bit more of a premium now with the increasing salary cap, and Courtland coming off the 2 best years of his career. And also this being probably the last big money deal that he'll sign in the NFL. You know, that's the reality. He's going to be in his 30s next time he signs. So it won't be as much of a contract. I just think that this is the opportunity for the 2 sides to remember how excited George Payton was when he came to the Broncos in 2021. He got his son a Courtland Sutton jersey. I just feel like this is kind of the full circle moment to where George can now help Courtland retire a Bronco.
No, I agree with you 100%. I hope that the team finds a way to get it done with Courtland. You know, I've seen Courtland's work ethic. This is a guy who works extremely hard. He's a great leader inside that locker room for the younger guys, that position. And that's something that Sean Payton has publicly noted there. So I think there's even some campaigning by Sean Payton saying, hey, we really, really like Courtland. We really want him here. Hopefully the team can find a way to do just that. Let's go to our next player here, Marvin Mims. We've kind of talked about it a little bit here. Will he be able to put on maybe a little bit more of a complete year, factoring what we saw, his strong finish down the second half of the schedule? Is that more so, in your opinion, is that a Marvin Mims thing as to why we didn't see it in the first half, or is that a coaching thing? I'm leaning on the coaching side just because I feel like we have 2 years of history from Sean Payton that kind of showcase like, hey, Marvin's got these traits. How come we're not getting him the football? There were even a lot of games, I think, in the first half of the season, you and I were sitting here post-game saying, how come Marvin Mims only had 10 offensive snaps or 14 offensive snaps in this game? Like that's crazy. It's ridiculous. And I hope that Sean Payton, the Broncos, can avoid that here in year number 2. Get him volume early on and let him thrive.
Agreed. And is it going to be more of a Jaden Reed or even Percy Harvin type situation, or is it going to be more of a Ted Ginn Jr. type of situation, right? I think that's the question right now. Is Ted Ginn Jr. was a great return man for the majority of his career and occasionally made splashes on offense. I think everybody in Broncos country wants to see the former, where Marvin Mims is making more of an impact on the offense as well as in the return game, where he's going for his 3rd straight All-Pro. Cody, my other big question here at receiver is, can Troy Franklin take that jump in year 2, right? I mean, we want to see Troy take the jump. It seems like everything we heard about the offseason program, everything you guys saw out there seems to indicate that a year 2 jump is very much in the cards for Troy Franklin.
Yeah, he's got a lot of confidence too. And I think the one thing that Troy had mentioned during the offseason, he did a sit-down interview, I think, with Eric Dalal of DenverBroncos.com. Then they kind of just talked about it, that where last year, Troy felt like at times he was thinking a little too much, whereas he's coming into the season, he understands the playbook a lot more. I think his role is more defined, I think, behind closed doors as to what the Broncos have kind of envisioned for him. And so with that, he's going out there and he's just playing and he's making plays. And on the last day of minicamp, I thought he had a terrific catch from Bo Nix with Jade Barron in coverage as well. And it would have been a big play for the Broncos in a real game. So I think that there's going to be a more concerted effort to feature Troy a little bit more. But I think his role is going to be clearly established. Whereas last year, what was it? Denver had Courtland Sutton. They had Marvin. They had Devaughn Vele, who emerged into a little bit of a big role early on. And then they had Josh Reynolds, who was getting a lot of featured snaps. So really for Troy, there wasn't an idea as to how Troy could get on the field right away as a rookie, right? That was something that they wanted to see. They loved his speed. But now I think we're actually going to see a lot more featured prowess here from a guy like Troy Franklin. And my question is, Sean Payton has hinted, we believe he can take that leap that Marvin did here in year number 2. If that's the case, it's good eating. Maybe the Broncos you get a touchdown, you get a touchdown, you get a touchdown. That's the hope here in terms of that line of thinking. But I agree with you. I think that's one of the bigger questions that we have surrounding Troy here. Let's take a look now maybe at Devaughn Vele. Devaughn has seemed like the consistent pillar opposite of Courtland Sutton, at least early on in the offseason program. He's expected to be ready for the start of training camp. We don't know exactly why he missed. I'm sure we'll find out over time if he wants to share that with us. But if he's there for day one, that's great news. He was getting the volume reps opposite of Courtland, and I think that Sean really likes the size of having a 6'5" and a 6'4" dude at wide receiver in their primary base foundational offense, and then getting everybody else involved. What would you say the biggest question for Devaughn Vele is coming into his second season? Because, obviously his case is different. He came into the NFL as an older rookie, and he didn't really look like a rookie most of the season, which is a good sign. But it's like, how much more can this guy grow considering he's getting up there? He's getting closer to 30. He's a few years away from it. But just considering how young he is, but how old he is at the same time.
Yeah, he's a really unique case, isn't he? Because he's not only an older guy, but as far as second-year players go, but he's also got elite athletic traits, and he's got all these different facets to his game that you're like, man, he just has so much untapped potential, especially from what we saw last year, where we didn't really see the Broncos use him a ton as a downfield guy, go up and make a play on the ball. We didn't see them use him a ton as a go-to weapon in the red zone. We didn't see his speed often exploited. He was almost like a big wide receiver, or doing what small wide receivers do, playing a big slot role, kind of making, tough contested catches at the sideline as well. So we saw the body control, we saw the catch radius at play, but did we really see Devaughn Vele, the vertical threat? Did we see him utilize his speed? Because he's a big time RAS guy, Cody. We know that. Devaughn Vele scored very well in the RAS department. He can jump, he can run, he's got a great catch radius. Utilize those things. I think that's the biggest question for me when it comes to Devaughn Vele this season.
I agree. I'm excited. And then we'll get to obviously the rookie Pat Bryant. I think, can he continue to build on his impressive offseason program performance when the pads come on? I'm excited about this because I think we will start seeing some mixing and matching where you might see Pat Bryant getting covered by PS2. How does he fare in coverage against PS2 at training camp? Riley Moss, these other guys. Riley also had coverage in the offseason program against Courtland Sutton a lot of the time and did really well. So for a lot of the people that are kind of, poo-pooing on Riley Moss there, I'm saying Riley had a good offseason program as well, and he's covering Courtland on a consistent basis. So, I think there's some comfortability level with the Broncos secondary. How does Pat Bryant do that when the pads come on? Because I guarantee you the Broncos are going to play a lot more press. And so I'm excited to see how he responds to press coverage. Once again, I just think he works well in traffic. He's great at creating separation as a route runner in the intermediate side of the field, where I think that's going to open up some opportunities for him this upcoming season to, I think, move the chains when it's a third down situation. Can he be a good red zone threat because of his route running ability? I think that's certainly a possibility here, but we're excited. And Broncos Country, we want to hear from you on today's episode of the show as we previewed the wide receiver position going into training camp. Do you agree with us that we believe that the Broncos wide receiver room, that top 5 is set in stone and guys are competing for touches, not necessarily roster spots there? If you feel like we got it wrong, make sure you let us know. Tell us who you think we should be keeping our eye on as well. We appreciate you so much, Broncos Country. Our training camp position preview series continues tomorrow as we take a look at the inside linebacker room here, quite arguably the biggest question mark on the Broncos defense going into 2025. You'll get all that and more on tomorrow's episode, Locked On Broncos.